I want to just start off by saying I am really excited about this conversation. One, because we have a lot of things to discuss in terms of what happens 364 days from today. Yeah, you like that countdown? I wake up in the middle of the night like, right? But also because I think we have a lot to discuss in terms of what it means to build the kind of movement that can win. I don't know about you, but I don't want to cross the threshold on November 4th next year on my hands and knees with my knees skinned and my legs bruised, right? And like drool coming down the side of my face. Like I would really like to know that coming into November 2020, we have built stronger. Not only did we win, but we changed the way that we win and that we've changed the way that power functions. So I'm excited about this conversation and I hope you are too. So let's just start off with the big why. Why this book and why right now?
Well, the why right now is easy.
Okay.
So why this book? I'm a law professor. I study racism. I've long thought of racism in a way that seemed obvious as a conflict between whites and people of color. That approach led to a certain amount of skepticism about what sort of change was possible. But it also seemed insufficient to me in 2008 to account for two phenomena, both of which we had to honor. One, that the country elected a black president, and two, that we were in the midst of a massive war against people of color, especially through mass incarceration. And a standard story that said, hey, this is white racism, whether it's expressed as implicit bias or expressed as structural or a vestige of Jim Crow, that seemed insufficient to account for both phenomena. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I realized what really explained mass incarceration was politics. Not politics as distinct from racism, but racism as politics. Once I got there, I started thinking, well, who's benefiting from this? And that led to another thought. If it turns out that the 0.1% is benefiting from racism, that shifts the way we can think about political coalitions. It opens up a possibility for fighting racism, not simply to protect people of color. And just to pause for a moment there, if fighting racism is just to protect people of color, we can't build the support we need to actually end racism because it will remain in the interests of the most powerful segments of society. So it opened up this new possibility. So I spent a few years writing that as a descriptive project. It was my book, Dog Whistle Politics, in 2014, kind of laid it out. Confident, as professors are, that clear analysis is sufficient to set society on the right course. And then Donald Trump read Dog Whistle Politics as a how-to manual, and he didn't seem to get that it was critique. And so then I said, okay, no, critique's important, but we actually need to figure out how to win. And so this book, Merge Left, is really a sort of a, hey, that was the description. Dog Whistle Politics was the description. Merge Left is, let's think about this in a deeper context, but let's actually figure out how to win. And that's a project that I ended up, I enlisted communication specialists and pollsters, did focus groups, interviewed activists, and actually did figure out how we can win.
All right, y'all ready?
We should maybe just stop there.
I know.
He's already said most important book of the time.
It is.
You know that we're gonna win. See y'all later.
Okay, but we have a lot of work to do to get to the finish line. So let me start off with a very provocative question, because as one of the co-creators of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, I have heard a lot of different assessments as to why we lost in 2016. One of those was like, oh, I wish those Black Lives Matter people had moved more black people to vote. That really would have gotten rid of Donald Trump. The other thing I heard, right, was that it was really racist working class white people in, rural areas, and they're responsible for Donald Trump. I've heard a lot of different autopsies about why 2016 went the way that it did. So I really just need you to settle this debate, and you do talk about it in the book. So what is the reason that we lost in 2016? Just keep it real with all of us. Everybody taking notes, BT Dubs?
So listen, almost every theory is plausible in the sense that the election was so close. You can identify various factors that would have produced a different outcome. Right? So I don't want to fight what if 7,000 more people in this one county in Pennsylvania had, whatever. The more fundamental question is, why was the election so close? What was it that allowed a manifestly incompetent business person, a boor, a laughingstock, to even come close in the first place? And the answer is clearly the way in which he mobilized racial resentment and racial fear. Now, I don't say that to discount class, and it's important to talk about the relationship between class and race. Let's say much of class resentment is culturally expressed through racial stories. So to say this was racism is not to say class didn't matter, the hardship that the white working poor are experiencing, the white working class experiencing, doesn't matter. That mattered, but they translated their economic rage, which, by the way, the economic hardship they experienced was not as intense as the hardship of the people of color in the working class. And yet they didn't go to Trump. So stop with this is working class pain that produces support for Trump. It didn't among people of color. And they actually suffer more when you look at the working class than the white working class. But something about the way in which the white working class experienced economic pain was translated into racial language. All right, that's even more nuance than we need. We need to be crystal clear. Donald Trump won because he effectively mobilized white racial resentment and anxiety. That's the number one reason he won. And here's let me just say this simply. Of course that's true. And the fact that we're still debating in 2019 tells you how deep a problem we have on the broad left, confronting the power of racism as a force capable of structuring our democracy, our political parties, our economy, and our culture. Because it is doing all those things. And to the extent that we can't see that, I mean, give me a break. The guy announced his candidacy by saying Mexicans were rapists. What was this campaign going to be about? It was going to be about race, right? Why can't we see that? And then once we recognize it, how do we fight back?
Okay. So we're on the same page. And then part of me, with all love and respect, said, prove it. And you do prove it in the book. But I do want to actually hear some of the work that you did with organizations who actually went out into communities in the snow and the sleet and the hail and tested some of these messages. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Can we need to depress the audience more first. Okay. So here's where we started. We started with, we can beat Trump in 2020. And I'll go even further. We stand at an inflection point in American society where, for the first time since the planter class got racism rolling 400 years ago, we have the possibility to convince the majority of people to break the fateful shackle of racism and to create a we the people, unbound by racism, unbound by sexism, unbound by homophobia. We stand at that moment.
You can clap for that. That was awesome.
And if we don't seize that moment, we will lose our democracy and we will lose our society. This is a very deep and profound crisis. So there is hopeful news, but I don't want to go to the hopeful. I want us to understand the depth of the crisis we're in and why we haven't been able to solve it. So let's back up for a second. we know that Donald Trump used race against us. Why do we know it? Well, if you were sentient, you watched him, broadcast. We're going to ban all Muslims. We're going to build a wall. We're going to save African Americans from their slums, where it's even more dangerous than some of the most dangerous places in the world. All of that. Also, you probably saw or you probably recognized that Donald Trump specifically modeled himself after Richard Nixon, that he used, or the Make America Great Again from Ronald Reagan, the silent majority, carnage in American cities, all of that's from Richard Nixon. This has been going on for 50 years. It's been 50 years since the Republicans figured out that as a matter of strategy, not bigotry, strategy, they could harness white racial resentment through coded language, the language of thugs and gangbangers and illegals, and versus the silent majority, the heartland, Make America Great Again. All of that is race, but all of it is race silent too, that they could use that as a strategy to win votes. Democrats realized it immediately too. How did Democrats respond? Democrats responded by saying, hey, we got to go silent. We can't challenge the racism of the Republican Party head on, because when we do, they turn around and accuse us of being the real racists, precisely because they're using code. They're talking about forced busing and states' rights and all of that stuff. And people are responding to it like, that's not racism. Of course we got to close the borders against terrorists who mean us harm, or whatever the rhetoric is. So Democrats say, hey, we're gonna stay silent. That didn't work. When did it not work? When did it fail spectacularly? With the Willie Horton ad. George H.W. Bush, George Bush the first, was running behind Dukakis when he ran the Willie Horton ad. Dukakis said, I'm going to do what Democrats have been doing since 1970. I'm going to stay silent on race. He stayed silent for a month. His position flipped, and Bush went on to win. Democrats said to themselves, we can't attack it directly. We can't stay silent. Enter Bill Clinton. And actually, just because this guy's really pissing me off, enter Thomas Edsall. I mentioned Thomas Edsall because he writes a regular column for the New York Times and just did it again on Sunday. Thomas Edsall's thesis in a book in 1991 called Chain Reaction was, Democrats did great, and the white working class loved them, right up until the 1960s when they started supporting civil rights for African Americans. Then they lost the white working class, ergo, dump African Americans. That's what he said in 1991. That's what Bill Clinton did. Started campaigning to end welfare as a way of life and to crack down on crime. Those were Republican themes. Thomas Edsall this past Sunday, if you look at his op-ed, you only need to read the first paragraph. His op-ed in the New York Times this Sunday starts by saying Democrats, in order to win the white working class, are going to have to alienate, indeed offend, African Americans, Latinos, and women. It's the same damn, luckily this isn't being recorded, advice. It's the same advice. And here's the logic of the advice. Democrats have to make a choice. They can either win with white folks and assume that people of color and women have no place else to go, or they can focus on issues of concern to people of color and lose with whites. What do you want to do? Right? And you'll notice if you go to this past Sunday's New York Times, opposite Edsall's essay was another op-ed by a woman of color saying, actually what's going to save us is 7 million young voters of color, and let's not worry about losing the white working class. Well, you might clap, but it's the same logic, right? It's the same logic. We need to choose. Who are you going to go with? White folks or people of color, right? And the way we express this is the working class. Often the white is dropped, but when people say we need to recruit the working class, they mean the white working class or the Obama coalition, right? But we're still having that debate in 2019, last weekend in the pages of the New York Times. Now we get to the good news. Should we get to the good news?
Let's get to the good news.
The assumption that you cannot talk about racism to white folks depends on how you talk about racism with white folks. if you talk about racism as a white problem, you will not be surprised to learn you alienate lots of white folks. This is not right. And any of you have tried this, and I know some of you have. Some of you have said, "Hi, dear white friend, we're going to talk about white privilege and why you ought to feel guilty." I don't know. It doesn't go so well, right? Listen, here's news. Here's something I didn't know. If you go to communities of color, African American and Latinos, not the activists, not the college-educated activists, but just out in the community, and you say the problem we face in our society is we have racist politicians beloved by millions of racists drawing on 400 years of racism. They don't like it either. The problem's too overwhelming, right? But notice what this says. If we try and organize a new coalition on a story that fundamentally says the big conflict in our society is white racism against people of color, we can't build the coalitions we need. What if we pivot? What if we say racism, the racial conflict, it's real, but where's the force come from it? Why its vigor? Why is it so powerful in 2019, 50, 60 years after the civil rights movement? What if it turns out that racism is being actively funded and promoted by some of the most powerful segments of our society today? And when I say some of the most powerful segments of our society, I mean, for instance, the party of big business, the GOP. I mean, the Trumps. I mean, the Mercers, who made billions on Wall Street and turned around and funded Breitbart and Steve Bannon. I mean, the Koch brothers, who wanted to protect their petrochemical industry, so they funded the Tea Party. And the Tea Party, that's all about racial hatred. That's what fueled it, right? Once we shift to that analysis, you can actually, here's the point. A story that says racism is being weaponized against all of us is a story that resonates powerfully with whites and with people of color. The idea that we have to choose our constituency is wrong. It not just resonates with whites and people of color, it resonates with the Democratic base and the persuadables in the middle who can go either way. So this is, I'm gonna write in here, merge the left. Merge the left. We can merge the working class and the Obama coalition with a message that says racism is being weaponized by elites against all of us. We are all harmed, not in the same way, not to the same extent, but whatever you want economic populism? Great. You're going to need to do that through a multiracial movement. You want racial justice? Fantastic. Me too. You're going to need to do that through a multiracial movement. You want to avert climate collapse? Great. You're going to need government to work for people. What's that going to take? A multiracial supermajority. How are we going to do that? Multiracial organizing, right? That's the merge left message. They're clapping even before they heard the evidence that it works.
I know, right? So I would imagine, and I know I experienced this, that there's some pushback to this idea. I mean, so much of our organizing strategy, right? So much of our strategy around building coalitions, so much of our strategy around trying to bring people together is to actually say, you need to pay more attention to the people who are most impacted. And oftentimes we leave white communities out of that conversation. So I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, how do you navigate this contradiction, right? Where so much of our work is saying, let's put people of color in front. And some of our work is saying, who cares what happens to white people, right? Just to be 100% honest.
I think the key is to be 100% honest, right? The key is to be 100% honest. And in that vein, let me say, this is the model that I'm coming from. This is who I was. I, as a Latino, became very interested in racism and fighting racism, starting in law school. I was coming out of a model that said racism is a white thing. Within that model, sort of operating within that framework, I had a perspective that said, we as people of color cannot organize sufficient power to fundamentally change the direction of this country. We can make moral demands, when we make moral demands, people of goodwill will support us. There's a long history of abolitionism, of white activism, and that's at least 10% of white folks. It's not enough. It's not enough. And that pushed me in a direction of thinking of my principal role as organizing and empowering people on the margins of society while resolutely speaking truth to power in a condemnatory fashion. That's who I was. That's what it seemed important for me to do. And it seemed important for me to do that because I was operating from a worldview in which racism was essentially permanent. We weren't going to get past it. And so much of what we were seeing in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s really did sort of push in that direction. And I think one other element. The other thing that's happening over these decades is the Democrats are systematically betraying people of color. They're systematically betraying people of color because the Democrats, starting in 1970, say to themselves, to the extent that we're aligned with, associated with people of color, we lose the white working class. If we lose white votes, we lose power. We need to walk away from civil rights. We need to walk away from communities of color. And again, Bill Clinton is the sort of poster child for this. He needs to condemn Sister Souljah. He needs to be present when a mentally impaired black man is executed who never should have been executed. Right now, he also goes on the Arsenio Hall show and has this sort of token, I'll play the saxophone or whatever, right? But the notion there is, hey, people of color don't have anywhere else to go because the GOP is far worse. But over and over again, what we hear from white centrists, liberal centrists, and frankly also from a sort of a white, sort of more radical economic populist wing is, we can't tackle racism. We're not going to do anything about civil rights. We're going to do very little about it. That's going to be secondary. And what develops is a sense among communities of color, we won't wait. We're going to go it alone. We have no choice but to go it alone. We can't really change things, but we can raise hell. We can disrupt, and we can organize what power we can in our communities, right? And that's, so I'm good with that. If it's true that racism is fundamentally a dynamic of whites versus people of color, if that's what it is, I'm good with that. But I shifted. And the reason I shifted is because the more I looked at racism, the more I don't want to take credit for this, so let me put it this way. The more I recovered, one of the big fundamental insights of all of our most radical figures, that racism was really an invention of the planter class. Or, that dates it in slavery. But you can think about it, you can think about the land speculators in Florida and in California systematically engaging in genocide to take land, to take children. That's racism for profit. That same dynamic carries all the way through to the Republican Party in 1963, when a relatively moderate party in terms of race says to itself, civil rights is causing anxiety among white voters. We can win votes by stimulating racial hatred. That is a business decision. And if you want to understand the vigor of racism today, it's because Fox News is investing in it. This is millionaires shilling for billionaires by peddling racist hate. And I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying this because it's tactically convenient. It's a powerful political message. I'm saying this because I think it's analytically true. This is the 400-year history of racism. Yes, once you get it rolling, people adopt it, and conflict between whites and non-whites is real, and we got to deal with it. But the impetus for it, the profit for it, the fuel for it is dollars. And if that's the case, then maybe we're organizing wrong. Maybe when we do anti-racist organizing, we're making a mistake when we say to white folks, white allies, you're the problem. The best you can be is an ally, but step back and feel guilty. Maybe that's just wrong strategically, practically, analytically. It's not true to what racism is. Racism's a weapon against all of us. And so this is where I come back and I say to folks, and well, we should talk about this at great length, but I say to folks, if you're committed to ending the most intense, horrifying expressions of racism today, let's name what those are. Mass incarceration, police killings of black and brown people, mass deportation, mass surveillance campaign against immigrants, systemic neglect of communities of color, withdrawal of funding for schools, for healthcare, for infrastructure, all of that. Okay, that's what we want to end. That's what we want to end. What is the proximate cause of all of those harms? The proximate cause of all of those harms is a competition between Republicans and Democrats through dog whistle politics to prove who can be tougher against communities of color for 50 years. And if you really want to end something, end it at its root. End it at its root. And that root is dog whistle politics. And that means we can end mass incarceration and mass deportation. In fact, we can build supermajorities that support repair. When supermajorities understand that mass incarceration is a crime against them. For some people, it's putting black and brown people in jail and destroying families and destroying communities. For others, it's the crime of electing politicians who take your health care, who take your pensions, who enact laws that siphon wealth up into the stratosphere. But we are all losing through a dog whistle politics that says people of color are the danger, and that then tries to prove we're the danger by jailing us or deporting us or caging us or ripping our children from us. We're all losing through that. And the best way to end it is a multiracial supermajority that turns out of office dog whistle politicians and that elects people beholden to a supermajority that's multiracial and committed to our shared fate, to our shared humanity.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Do y'all agree with that? Everybody's like... But can we get down to brass tacks? Because let's be real. Not all of us are in it together. And so there's times when we, for the purposes of unity, right? And as an invitation, we say all of us are being harmed or all of us are being impacted. But as we know, all of us are not being impacted the same. And so in this dynamic of what it means to build the kind of coalition where everybody can be a part, there are choices that people have to make. And there are choices that are needing to be made, in particular amongst folks who are not a part of the working class, who are not a part of the middle class, which is quickly becoming the working class, right? But folks who may have liberal politics, but are also wealthy and they're making money from racism, but they don't see themselves in that way, right? So they may be big Democratic Party donors, right?
They may be in this room.
You don't have to out yourself, but I'm asking this question for you. There are choices that have to be made. And so the way I was taught, strategy-wise, is that part of what it means to be an ally against racism and anti-racist is that sometimes those who benefit most from it, whether you be working class or whether you be wealthy, y'all need to have a conversation with each other. Right? And so I bring this point up because as I was reading the book, I was like, I know what you're not saying, but it could come across this way, is that white folks, you're off the hook. right? Because we're all being impacted. And it's like, well, some of us are making choices about how we line our pockets, how we pay for our kids to go to school, how we pay for our mortgages or whatever, and the values that we have, right? So, how do we grapple with this? How do we grapple with wealthy liberal folk who are benefiting from the weaponization of racism, but also see themselves as a part of the solution?
Yes, definitely, definitely. Let me answer on two levels. One in terms of external pressure, and the other in terms of the internal psyche of the white liberal. This is going to be fun.
Oh, San Francisco.
In terms of external pressure, look. Part of the reason that 2019 is the pivotal moment when we can really change the direction of the country is because of the activism of Black Lives Matter. It's because of the activism of young people of color, especially young women of color. There's so much energy, and there's so much commitment, and the analysis, the willingness to say, I will fight racism, and I will disrupt. I will not be a second-class citizen in any movement. That's huge. It's huge. So right now we're in a situation in which we need to build a multiracial movement. And let me just be clear. For the most part, when I walk into audiences and I say we need to build a multiracial movement in which we understand racism as a weapon against all of us, the first reaction I get is amen from white people. Because they're relieved. They're like, yeah, I want to be part of a multiracial movement. They're also assuming they're not actually going to have to do anything. And I get a lot more pushback from people of color. If I can get people of color to say, yeah, we need to build this movement, they then say, and we're going to kick some butt to make sure that it's actually a racially egalitarian multiracial movement.
Right.
And we have to count on that because that has to happen. So external, right? That's going to be huge. Let me talk for a second though about what's happening among most whites. And when I say most whites, I literally mean 80% of whites. This is also really important among, actually, let me just say, if you think that these dog whistle messages, these messages about fearing thugs and people from terrorist countries who mean us harm and illegals and we need to build a wall, if you think you're immune to them, you're probably not. There's really good evidence, both from our study and from social psychological studies. These dog whistle messages have a lot of resonance with white Democrats, right? So that many white Democrats are shifting to take a strong anti-racist stance, but anti-racism for them means condemning Trump. It doesn't mean getting over fear of people of color. So here's where most white liberals are. They believe two things. They believe they are threatened by people of color, blacks and browns, and changing demographics. And very often they believe that at a sort of an internalized, implicit, subconscious level, but it's pretty darn easy to trigger. In fact, there was just a study that showed that white Democrats, when they see a campaign commercial, they support the Democratic candidate at one level. When they see the same campaign commercial translated into Spanish with English subtitles, so they get it, right? They get the meaning. They're not losing any meaning. It's just in Spanish with English subtitles. Support for the Democrat goes down 10%. Support for the Republican goes up 11%. That's a 21-point shift when an ad is in Spanish for white Democrats. White liberals hold two thoughts. One is, I'm under threat. I don't know what it means to be in a country that's increasingly black and brown. I don't necessarily feel comfortable with young people of color, young men of color. They hold that belief. They also hold this belief. We ought not to oppress black and brown people because they're black and brown. They hold both, right? Now, I want to say, yeah, there's a contradiction, but I also want to say there's a feedback between them. Let's say you believe that you're threatened by black and brown people. And somebody comes to you and says, we ought to make sure that black and brown people aren't oppressed. On one level, you're like, yeah, I agree with that. But on another level, because you're fearful, you limit what you understand oppression to mean. You say, well, I agree with that. And that's why I will never have dinner with somebody who uses racial epithets. But then somebody says, well, actually, it's more than just condemning racial epithets. We need to integrate our schools. We need to welcome refugees. And all of a sudden, it's like, that's not oppression just because we have segregated schools.
Right.
I love Orinda, or wherever you happen to be. Right? This is real. Now, Alicia's like, I didn't say that. Again, this is not being taped. This is not being taped. This is not for public. This is just internal.
Yes.
Switch the. No, okay, now imagine instead you believe two different things. One, that oppression of people of color is wrong, is morally wrong, and also that you believe that you are being encouraged to fear people of color because when you do, you won't notice that the rich are ripping off the system and rigging the rules for themselves. Let's say you come to believe two things again. One, that most of the fear of people of color is manufactured BS. That really people of color are just people, not particularly threatening, and all the lies about us being threatening are orchestrated by the greedy rich who understand that if they get us fearing and fighting each other, they can rig the rules of the system for themselves. And that's not hard to believe. You can just say Donald Trump. Like, you can see it in action. Let's say you believe that, and you believe that you ought not to oppress brown and black people. Mm-hmm. Now, if someone comes to you and says, hey, we ought not to oppress brown and black people, you understand that differently. This is not just a matter of, hey, we got to take care of brown and black people, but I'm only willing to do so long as I'm protected. This is, oh my gosh, you're right. We ought not to oppress brown and black people because when we do, it fuels the lie that imperils my own family. Right? And so this is the argument. We need to bring people in to anti-racism work. How do you bring people into anti-racism work? The traditional route is to say, this is the morally right thing to do. And again, that's great for 10% of the folks. But most folks say, hey, it may be moral, but at the end of the day, I'm worried about my family. I don't know what it means for my kids if they're going to be a minority in a country in which they've been historically the majority. If instead people are saying to themselves, oh man, I look around and I see that racism has been weaponized against me, that this explains Donald Trump, that this explains why we've taken government and it's now run for the corporations, that I want to avert climate collapse. But when I try and avert climate collapse, I look at what government's doing and it's actually working for the Koch brothers in the petrochemical industry. How do I turn that around? Oh, racism is a weapon against me. I have to get serious about not oppressing black and brown people. And now someone comes to you and says, we need to integrate. And what does that sound like? That actually sounds like salvation. Or at least it sounds like salvation when Black Lives Matter is also kicking your butt, right? Because that's where it comes back in. So this is the argument. Talking about racism as a class weapon is not meant to exclude the hard conversations we have to do about the way in which we've all been shaped by racist thinking if we've grown up in this country or even if we've immigrated to it. It's meant instead to invite people to understand their well-being and the security and the safety of their family, the survivability of the planet depends upon fighting racism against black and brown people because that's been weaponized politically. Mm-hmm. And if people can understand that, they're much more likely to do the hard work of saying, okay, what do I have to do? How do I actually build social solidarity? How do I actually promote integration?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, okay. I know, right? In time for the election. I have a bunch of other questions, but before I ask them, I want to encourage you all to write your questions down. I have 3 really good ones up here, and I'm not going to reveal them until later. However, I want to make sure your questions make it up here too. So if you have them, write them down and pass them on. Let's get into 2 things. So your book, Dog Whistle Politics, was incredible. It is incredible. Have y'all read it?
Just fake it. Just say, yeah.
Okay, that's all right. That's all right.
I like that. Okay, I can be honest, but you all need to be
Yeah.
flattering.
Okay. So, promise me you'll read it. We're going to do a little Cliff Notes section right now. I'm going to give you a teaser so that as the holidays are coming, not only are you getting this for everybody in your family, but you're getting its companion, which is Dog Whistle Politics. So let's do a quick primer for people so that folks understand what a dog whistle is. And one of the things that really struck me from the book was that Dog Whistle Politics, actually Dog Whistle Politics, the phrase, got into the Merriam-Webster dictionary. That's boss. That's boss.
Except they got it wrong.
I know. Okay, we're getting there. So this was my whole question. It's like, okay, if Merriam-Webster got it wrong, we're getting it wrong too. So I want you to talk a little bit about what characterizes dog whistle politics versus like really explicit racism or just like things that we don't like.
Yeah.
And then also, sorry, there's a part two, because I too, professor, and I like to do multiple parts to a question and make sure you answer all of them. It's not just white folks who are susceptible to dog whistles. People of color are susceptible as well. And I found that really fascinating. So if you could first break down the concept so we're all here in it together, and then go into what does it look like with folks of color and why are communities of color moved by dog whistle racism as well?
Yeah, great questions. So the normal way we think about dog whistles or dog whistle politics is we think about it in terms of the metaphor. So dog whistle is a whistle used to train dogs. It sounds at such a high frequency that human ears can't hear it, but dogs can. And so as a metaphor, it suggests speech operating at two levels. Don't think about it that way. Okay. Yes, that's partly true. So you can illegal alien, for example, on one surface doesn't directly mention race, on another clearly triggers racism, right? What many people do is they turn around and say, okay, so dog whistle politics is whenever a politician speaks in code in a way that has different meanings for different audiences. For example, when Barack Obama says, we will get to the promised land together, some people turned around and said, well, that has a special resonance for African Americans that may elude most whites. Therefore, Obama was engaging in dog whistle politics. If Obama is engaging in dog whistle politics when he says we will get to the promised land together, it's lost all meaning. So let's be clear. All language is fundamentally ambiguous. All politicians carefully craft their language to say different things to different audiences. That's retail politics. Happens all the time. What's important about dog whistle politics, what's pernicious about it, it's an intentional effort to trigger racism. Or to say this more generally, it's an intentional effort to trigger socially reviled hatreds while pretending to do no such thing. So it says illegal aliens are invading, right? Triggering racist hatreds based on sort of brown people and da-da-da. And then it turns around and says, wait, I didn't mention race. Illegal's a crime. It's not a race. Oh, invasion? And you think that's racial? No, it's just they're flooding across like vermin. Again, I didn't say racial, right? So that's the trick. And you can, and it's very important to understand it because then you can see dog whistle politics operate in terms of homophobia, for example, where someone says, I'm not homophobic. I just think I just want to protect children in bathrooms. Right? So again, neutral, but designed to trigger socially reviled hatreds. Right? And you can see this operating with respect to gender, with respect to Islam. I have nothing against Islam except for the fact that many of them worship death. You're just like, wait, what? You know, there's the denial and then okay, so that's what's important about dog whistling. Now, shifting. It's very important that people understand that these messages resonate powerfully, not just in communities of color, but with majorities of Latinx and African Americans. When we tested a dog whistle message to understand how powerful it was, majorities Democrats, majorities of union households, majority of Latinx, majority of African American agreed with dog whistle messages. Why? Partly it's just because it's operating in code, but the real answer is a little bit deeper and a little bit more frightening. The problem we're confronting in our society, I want to make a sharp distinction. The problem we're confronting in our society is not white people. It is whiteness. It is whiteness. And what is whiteness? Whiteness is a set of beliefs that says lighter is better, darker is worse. Lighter is human, darker is subhuman. Whiteness. Now, it's true that many white folks are susceptible to believing in whiteness, though many white folks also reject it and work actively against it. It's also important and true that many people in communities of color endorse whiteness. They often endorse whiteness not necessarily in the form of saying they're white, but in the form of believing that being lighter is better, that being darker is worse, that being assimilated is better, that speaking with an accent is worse, that being undocumented is worse, that being a citizen is better, right? That is, we're all human. We're all human. And a lot of what humans do is look for a way to feel good about themselves by seeking to build themselves up by tearing other people down. And whiteness is one of the most powerful ways we do that in our society. And many people of color do that. And so within communities of color, if a politician comes and says, I represent hardworking people and I'm going to crack down on welfare queens. I represent people who stood in line and came the right way, and I'm going to crack down on illegals. We might turn around and say, hey, underlying that is a basic story about whites being threatened by people of color. But many people in communities of color say, that's right. I'm hardworking. I stood in line. I did it the right way. And those people are the real menace to our society. Right? And so when we organize, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to organize a new political movement that insists on a vision of all of us being in this together and nobody being subhuman. Put differently, and I wouldn't put it in this way in sort of political organizing because it's too latent, but for this audience, we're trying to organize a political movement that says whiteness threatens all of us. It's prevalent among whites, it's prevalent among people of color. When we believe in whiteness, we accept division and we fight with each other. And when we do that, we give up on collective action and we give up on government and we lack the power to fight those who really threaten us, those who have the power and the money and the resources and who actually control the levers of society. Whiteness is what's been weaponized against all of us.
Amen. You can bring your question up to me. Did you have it? Okay, excellent. That was bomb. We are coming to the Q&A portion in about 5 minutes. So I want the call to action. Okay? Y'all are going to read this book, correct?
Yeah.
And you're also going to get the companion one, correct? Hello, correct? Okay. Give us the 3 things that we need to do going into 2020. Now, let me give you some context. This morning, I went to my yoga class, very Bay Area. But my yoga class is led by the insurmountable Linda Burnham, who, if you don't know who Linda Burnham is, you need to get to know who Linda Burnham is. And I'm not going to tell you, Google it, and then you'll know why my class is so cool. But she said to me this morning, which she says to me at least 3 times a year, we really have to get it together. We really have to get it together. And I'm worried that we're not thinking about what it means for us to get it together. So that's how I started my morning after doing lots of inversions and all the things. So I was excited about tonight's conversation because I was like, well, Ian's got all the answers. So Ian, what are the 3 things that the people in this room need to do going into 2020 in order for us to start on that journey of building an effective and powerful multiracial movement for the sake of the multiracial democracy that we all deserve?
So this will be quick. So the number one thing is to recognize we can build a powerful multiracial movement right now. And the reason I say that is because we ran this 2-year study. And what we did in our 2-year study is we tested the power of different messages, a racial fear message, the idea that we should lead with racial justice for communities of color, the idea that we should emphasize economic populism but never talk about race, and then another message that said, basically, we believe in each other across race lines, right? Race conscious. We know we're being divided by people who, when they divide us, rig the rules and siphon wealth away and take away everything we need. When we come together, we'll all do better, white, black, and brown, right? White, black, and brown. That is, this was a race-conscious message that called for class solidarity and made it clear that as a fight against racism, it was also going to benefit whites. That was the message. And then we tested it. That message, we tested 9 versions of it. All 9 beat the dog whistle racial fear message. That message did better than colorblind economic populism. That message, probably the most stunning test of this, a group in Minnesota took this message to rural Minnesota, white Minnesota, tested it in Minnesota. They tested it against a message that said, hey, we need economic populism. The economic populism message against a Republican, we need to fear sanctuary cities message, lost in rural Minnesota. A message that said we need to come together, join hands across racial lines, fight those who are rigging the system while trying to divide us, and together we will get government back on all of our sides, white, black, and brown. 25 points better against the Republican message than the colorblind message in rural Minnesota. And once they tested it, they then translated it into an actual campaign in 2018. This was SCIU Minnesota, Faith in Minnesota. It was so effective, the Democrats finally got on board, right? And they wiped the floor in Minnesota in 2018. We can do this now. I should also add, this approach is being used to organize youth of color in urban California. Again, so the number one thing is realize a message of cross-racial solidarity that is class conscious and says we're in this to get government on the back on the side of working families to promote economic justice and racial justice can work right now. Okay. Number 2, in terms of what you can do, organize the broad left. Speak to the choir. Right, because what's happening right now is precisely what I described earlier about what's happening in the New York Times. We have a fractured left. Part of the left, again, the broad left, part of the left is convinced that we have to focus on class issues, even if that leaves a lot of racial justice issues out in the cold. And part of the left is convinced that we need to focus on racial justice, and if white people are alienated, so be it. And frankly, there's a new emerging trend. Part of this new emerging trend says everything for the environment, nothing for anything else. This is a fractured left. A fractured left will lose in 2020. So in a way, I think a lot of us tell ourselves, hey, we need to go out and recruit people in, wherever who think very differently. It's like, no, actually, the biggest problem on the left right now is that the choir's fractured. Preach to the choir in the sense of building unity and energy across the choir. That's number 2. I get number 3, right? So get the third.
You do get 3.
Do not think about this as simply an electoral strategy. Recognize that we are at this pivotal moment in the broader history of the United States, that this is a moment of profound change for the country, that for the last 50 years and for 400 years before, but for the last 50 years, some of the most powerful segments of the society have been investing heavily in stoking racial hatred. And that we are engaged now in a decades-long effort to get us back on track and to actually, this is going to be a decades-long project of cultural change in which we are convincing as many people as possible that whiteness is the fateful shackle for all of us, that we can break that shackle now in our generation, right? And so you're not committing you're committing to a program that's going to win in 2020, but that also commits you to a program of really making sure that we the people, is we the people, all of us, undivided by race, undivided by gender, undivided by sexism and homophobia, certainly undivided by classism and whether you're documented or not. We, the people, are the people who live here and who are going to fight for each other. And that's who we always thought we were. That's our national ideals. But we're at a moment in which we can embrace and actually fulfill those ideals. And it's not 2020 and it's not 2030. This is going to be a decades-long project. But that's the actual project that you're committing to.
Did y'all take notes? Because that was dope. No, seriously, did you take notes? Okay, so we just had this whole conversation, and I'm going to read these two questions together. One as a testament to not only how much this book is needed, but how difficult it is to really rid ourselves of the impetus to just try to boil a thing down to class. So let me read this question. You're going to understand where I'm coming from. This question is, are you implying that we will bring white people into anti-racist work and or politics through fear of being economically disenfranchised, even if they're already poor white voters? Then why not just make this a class issue? If you want whites to see that what is bad for people of color is bad for them. Okay? Now let me add this question, because one aspect that we have not talked about actually is gender. White women made up 42% of the electorate in 2016, more than white men, and Black and Latinx men and women voters combined. We also know that 53% of white women who voted in 2016 voted for the Orange Menace. The Orange Menace. I have a lot of other names for him. But I think Toupee Fiasco is my favorite. That's a good one, right? Okay, back to business. How can we persuade white women to vote progressive and overcome our racism? Ooh, please, this could be the next book.
I love both questions because both questions basically have the same answer, which is, we're making a mistake when we think about race as biology. Race is a set of ideas about social identity and social relationships. And because it's a set of ideas about social identity and social relationships, it's inseparable from other sorts of social relationships. So in the first case, it's inseparable from class. A conversation with whites about class alone fails. And it fails because it doesn't address what's really animating most white voters. And this was crystallized for me. We had a woman who said, it was a white woman who said, what do I care about the fight for 15 if I'm worried my husband's job site is going to be blown up by a terrorist? Right? So there's a right, and now we want to say, well, statistically speaking, that's much less likely than the fact that you're not going to have any food and can't pay a $400 bill. But correct. Yeah, that's not how you, right? This is about stories. Wow. And what's happening with people is they're being convinced that the threat in their lives comes from Black and brown people. And if you respond to them by saying, "But I can get you a good job," they're like, "What?" Right? So. Race and class are inseparable in the way they've been discussed and the way people think through them. You must do both. And in fact, you must recognize that the most powerful class weapon, the most powerful weapon that the rich have in the class war they are winning, the most powerful weapon of the rich in the class war they are winning is racism. Mm-hmm. Right? So please don't understand this as class alone or racism alone. That. But same with white women. And white women makes it actually more interesting. To look at white women as qua white women is to be very frustrated. To say, well, what happened? Why didn't they get it? I mean, he wasn't just a Toupee Menace. He was a confessed sexual assaulter. Mm-hmm. What? Right? I mean, it was just inconceivable. But it comes into closer focus when you actually talk about white evangelical women. Mm-hmm. It was white evangelical women. It was the confluence of race plus gender plus religion.
Dang.
They voted overwhelmingly for Trump. If you look at the popularity of Trump among white women who are not evangelical, it drops to about 30%.
This is fascinating.
Right? Both among college educated and non-college educated. White women who are not evangelical loathe Donald Trump. This is not a white women go get your sister's problem. It's a what's going on with white evangelicals. And what's going on with white evangelicals is starting in the 40s and 50s, corporate America started investing in evangelical pastors to push them towards an interpretation of the gospel that favored the free market. Then in the 50s and the 60s, when whites fled public schools rather than integrate, they fled into Christian academies. And evangelical churches became pro-segregation churches. Then in the 60s and the 1970s, evangelical churches were organized as a stance against feminism and against gay rights. They are the perfect soldiers for someone like Donald Trump. They are pro-business, anti-people of color, anti-women, anti-gay, LGBTQ. Right? And that's why when you look at who Trump's trying to mobilize, that's his base. This is the way in which race is deeply tied with other elements of identity, with Christianity, with gender, with homophobia, right? So we really need to understand what we're up against is a set of ideas. And the way you fight a set of ideas is with a better set of ideas that shows people that these better ideas will actually take care of themselves, take care of them, and protect their families. Right? That's the move.
This is dope. Hey, 4 minutes. Dang. Okay. Well, I like to connect things. And last time I was here at the Commonwealth Club, which I love, I was here with Dr. Ibram Kendi. Yeah, you can give it up for Dr. Kendi. He was a bomb. And so this question, and have you read his book? Of course you have, Ian. Of course you have. You can too.
I'm obligated to say yes.
Yes. Well, I hope you have, because this is a question that is related to his book. I hear you say racism equals fear of Black people. Can you put your book findings in context of Ibram Kendi's assertion that it's about racist policies versus individual white people wanting to oppress people of color? I.e., how do we merge, not only merge left, but how do we merge Ian Haney Lopez and Dr. Ibram Kendi? Fascinating question. Whose question is this? Thank you. That was excellent.
So I worry a little bit about a couple of moves that Kendi makes. And one is to think about policies in a way that gets away from individuals and from culture, because it's the stories we tell that ultimately either support a policy or tolerate it or justify it, right? So I worry a little bit about that. I worry a little bit about a sharp distinction between racist and anti-racist. Here's one of this was really stunning for me. We wanted to understand how to talk to people about racism being used as a weapon against us. So we wanted to understand people's views, racial views. And one of the first focus groups we did was with a couple of white guys in Ohio, and I kind of went into it thinking this is going to be bad. And let me tell you, it was bad. It was bad. They had lots of racist ideas. What I didn't understand is that they also had lots of racially egalitarian ideas too. Being a racist is not one thing. It is not stable, and it is not monolithic. It is not determinative of one's identity. Frankly, I catch racist thoughts impinging on my reactions and have to say, well, I know where that came from. I got it right. I don't think there's anybody here who's fully anti-racist. I think that part of being anti-racist is recognizing the way in which we're steeped in racism, and that it imbues our thoughts and our judgments and our biases in really surprising, surreptitious ways, and we're constantly on guard, and we have to constantly be on guard against it. This is the important insight, I think, from Merge Left. Roughly 80% of Americans are steeped both in racist fears and in racially egalitarian hopes. And our project is to convince people that it's their hopes, their racially egalitarian hopes, that will make them safe and that will allow them to create the sort of fulfilling society that will protect their children, that will be rewarding for their children, that will protect the planet in which we all have the best possible chance to thrive. This is a view that rejects the idea that we're stuck either in a binary, we're either racist or anti-racist. And it understands that it's a process and that it's a movement and that we can be pulled in different directions. I think the right understands this. The right is spending all of its time telling people, vote your racist fears. Your racist fears will keep you safe. Those people are dangerous and undeserving. These are still people. There's elements of them that are messed up. There's elements of them that are beautiful and hopeful. We need to connect with those beautiful and hopeful elements, not on a sort of kumbaya, let's hold hands, but on a let's get real. Our beautiful, hopeful elements will save us, will save our families, will save our societies. That's the project.
All right. Can we give it up, please? I really, really want to thank you for such an incredible conversation, but also for an incredible